Hi fellow painters, and welcome to another painting tutorial from Ian at Promethean Paints. This is the first part of a series focusing on the Knight Abhorrent, an amazing Chaos Knight. I would say miniature, but he's a big chunky boy. I've broken it down into different parts, and today's part we're going to be looking at how we painted the the main frame and the blue armour, so the sort of carapace armour. We're going to be using the dry brush and the airbrush today. So there you can see the sub-assemblies that I've broken the model down into. The kit allows you to do this with no fuss. And then I primed the model using just some Vallejo black primer through the airbrush, but any dark primer will do. I then went over the model with AK Tenebrous Grey because I wanted a sort of different shadow colour in case any, especially for the main frame. Tenebrous Grey is a nice dark dusty colour, a bit like Corvus Black. Any very dark grey is good, and when you dry brush over with silver, and that's the first step here. So over the main dark primer I'm using AK gunmetal, a medium-sized dry brush, and now it's just a rather straightforward mundane task of just going around the entire frame of the model, so no armour, and just dry brushing now with the silver. The end goal, as you see from the images, is we've got a really rusty, dirty frame, hence why I'm just giving this a very basic dry brush. It doesn't matter if you leave a bit of the Tenebrous Grey or your sort of coal black that you've used in the deepest shadows. Because of the weathering, a lot of this is going to get covered up anyway, but you'll notice with the dark colour underneath that where it's just not a straight flat black, you get a nice a difference in tone with the model. It's okay to go straight over black, but I would recommend using like a Tenebrous Grey. There's Ionic Coal Black, there's Corvus Black. They are a black, but they're more like a dark grey that has a hint of a different colour in it. Tenebrous Grey has a hint of green and purple. Coal Black has a hint of blue from the Ionic range. Corvus Black is a bit more grey. You get Rubber Blacks. They just offer a different end result that's a bit different from just going over just your standard black. So yeah, just work yourself all the way around. If you do get anything over an area that you like some of the armour panels that we'll be painting eventually in blue, you can just go back over it with a brush with your base coat colour that you originally used. Don't have to be too gentle here. These models have a lot of glue points on them. Obviously the reason for the sub-assemblies is, one, it becomes easier to handle. It will also become easier to transport if you've got these in multiple bits, especially the Chaos ones, because there's spiky bits and all sorts. Keeping the arms separate allows you to weapon swap, and again for transport, and it's just better for the painting. You can, instead of having to hold this bulky monster, you can hold them in smaller parts, get better access to certain areas. So I would definitely recommend, even if you glued on the armour panels, which is fine, but I would certainly recommend leaving the top and bottom parts separate and leaving the arms off. And if you're going to be doing some of that freehand on the shoulder pads, definitely leave off the shoulder pads as well. At this stage, I'm just showing you, as you know, my videos are generally full length. All you're going to be seeing me do here is dry brushing across the miniature. So feel free to speed this section up. But I will show you how I've done each part. And there we go, that's the dry brushing done. About 20 minutes it took in total. So we're now going to move on to getting the blue of our armour. Now I'm going for a Night Lords type theme here, but this principle of using Vallejo white ink and then a contrast paint over the top you can use for reds, yellows, greens, any colour you're thinking of doing at night. I find the blue is a nice colour as a sort of base coat. Any colour looks really good over this dark blue. So what we're doing here technically is called volumetric highlights, which is a really fancy word of creating contrast. So we use the white ink, so wherever the bright white is, that's where our blue will be most intense, and where it's not so bright, the blue will be darker. So any areas that you want to be bright, you have a sort of heavy layer of the white ink. So we're just using the natural sort of effect that the airbrush gives of the haloing, where you get a bright center gradiented out to a cooler, darker edges. And I'm just thinking about where I'd like my highlights to be, where I imagine the light would be gathering, not so much realistic, but where I'd like the eye to focus. Generally across the edges, along that centre ridge. Don't forget we will be doing lots of weathering as well, and so a lot of this will be covered, but this is just good basing here. It also allows us to think about that I'm not necessarily going to be doing any painting highlights, like edge highlights or anything on the blue, because there's going to be sort of freehand and weathering. So using this volumetric lighting gives us the effect of some decent highlights. Now we're using the airbrush here, so, and you know that we've already dry brushed some of this in silver, so just take care if you've got the airbrush. I don't use an expensive one, I've got a cheap Fender airbrush, it's £20 off of Amazon. You can still get good control with it. You could use masking putty or tape off the areas that you've already dry brushed in silver. You could do this the other way around, in airbrushing everything and then dry brushing, but you could start damaging or rubbing off the paint. But it's just short, sharp bursts with the airbrush. When it starts to glisten or shine, move that airbrush away because there's a bit too much paint left on the area. But airbrushing nights is really good practice actually, of doing your volumetric highlights and getting used to how the airbrush works. Recently, a lot of people are using those makeup sponges, which I might be doing a tutorial on. I've got a set myself. I'm going to try it. So if you're using makeup sponges, you would just dab them into the center and you get that same haloing effect. You could of course dry brush this, starting with a sort of dark white, off-white colour, moving up to pure white in dry brushing with a nice soft dry brush. But of course the airbrush gives us these results really quick. I understand not everyone can technically afford an airbrush. They are a medium to high level tool in our arsenal that we have, but as soon as you can afford to get one, I would recommend it. It just expands your tool and your arsenals and what you can do and how quick you can get the results. Especially on larger models, if you're having a Titan army or a Knight army or a sort of large army with lots of tanks, an airbrush will become your best friend. So yeah, this is Vallejo white ink, straight into the airbrush. A few short sharp sprays on each area. Gives you that nice transition from bright to dark. Now we're going over this with a rather darkish blue anyway, so the transitions, when you've got that Tenebrous Grey in the outsides, you get really good transitions straight away with very little effort. So for the blue, as I said, we're using a Warhammer contrast paint. I'm using Tallasar blue, which is a sort of mid-tone. You can get a lighter one like Frost Heart blue and a darker blue. Tallasar is that mid-tone. And much like the ink, we just use a few layers here, gentle with the airbrush, because this is quite a very liquidy paint, the contrast paints. They seem quite thick when you brush this on, but through the airbrush, it's almost like water. And it's just very short, sharp bursts through the airbrush, getting that layering across. Now, it doesn't matter if you get any over some of these other areas where you've not done any dry brushing. We're going to be doing a lot of gold trim, and gold goes, this is almost black when it goes over that. Just take care around any areas there where there's been some dry brushing. Bit more control with your airbrush. If you do get any over it, then because we did a sort of rough dry brush, you can just paint over it with a bit of your base coat dark colour that you use, and then just re-dry brush the area. These are old battered knights, so a little bit of overspray here and there doesn't necessarily matter. Okay, so as you've seen there, very simply, we've now base coated everything. I will then definitely apply, I can't stress this enough, a couple of layers of AK Ultra Matte Primer. I mean, it doesn't have to be AK Ultra Matte Primer, it can be any matte primer, but definitely a couple of coats over the top. And then as you see here, I've re-base coated anything where I had some oversprays and some nastiness, especially on the armour panels. I've just taken the time just to paint those back in Tenebrous Grey. The matte primer will blend everything together and protect it, and that's the main goal here, especially for the weathering. We wanted some protection. So from our gold, we're going to be starting all the trim. There's a lot of trim on this guy. I'm going to be doing a base coat of AK Burnt Tin. This is almost like your Balthazar gold in the Warhammer range. And so just carefully go around now and paint all of the trim with this base coat of Burnt Tin. This is our darkest metallic colour and will allow us to get some really good transitions from some quite bright gold down to some dark gold. Those eagle-eyed viewers will notice my armour, my shoulder pads look a bit different at this stage. I'll go over it more when I do the freehand tutorial, but I used snips and some files and then a bit of glue over the top just to smooth it out to clean off all of the markings that are on the shoulder pads, because I wanted to do the freehand. But of course, if you're not doing the freehand, then you'd have all those markings to paint. So once the burnt tin has dried, then move on to AK Rusty Gold, which is a mid-tone gold colour. And now I'm layering this on to the burnt tin, leaving the burnt tin in the deepest recesses, but probably covering 90% of the armour panel now in this rusty gold. A little bit thin down the paint just to start getting some nice transition, but nothing too clever here, making sure to edge highlight everything with this colour. But yeah, this is our main colour here that will be bit out, so yeah, a good 90% coverage. You could start with rusty gold, but then you might have to do a few layers of washes over the top. For the highlight of the gold trim, I use AK Old Gold, which is a bit like Retributor Gold from Warhammer. And this is an edge highlight, and just picking out the areas that you want to be a bit brighter with where that light might hit. So what I found when you look at images, gold actually has a bright reflection in the folds. So where there's that folding, normally we'd think to paint that darker, but you find with gold the light bounces quite often inside of that fold on the trim. And yeah, this is an edge highlight. As you can see here, my brushwork is scratchy, it's not precise. This is an old knight from Chaos, so we know it's not going to be crystal clean. They don't polish it every weekend when the sun's out. So this is where you can add a little bit of battle damage, a little bit of wear and tear. So it doesn't have to be exactly precise. Just take care you don't get anything over onto that blue armour. And just pick out the highlights where you want it to be brighter. I don't want to make a even brighter highlight, but I want it to be a sort of desaturated gold. So I use a bright silver. This one's from Warhammer. I can never remember the name of it, but it's their bright silver colour. And I just do a sort of 50-50 mix of a bit of silver and a bit of the bright gold to make a desaturated gold. And this I do a rough edge highlight, scratches and scrapes. Not everything is highlighted with this, just the areas that I want to be most brightest. Especially if you pick out some of those little rivets, just where you'd imagine some of that light is catching, where there's a bit of damage. And mixing your gold with your silver does give you a nice bright highlight, but it also makes it look a little bit desaturated, a little bit heavily worn. So as you can see, I'm just focused on one of the shoulder pads, but you know, you're painting the entire model here, but sometimes breaking it into sections takes away the monotony. We're now going to do a wash. Now I'm using AK Tenebrous Grey. You could use Nolan Oil, you could use Agrax Earthshade, any dark wash. And what I'm doing here is I've made, as I said, a wash of this, so it's one drop of paint and many drops of water to a nice thin consistency, but not too thin that you need dozens of layers to get a coverage. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the Tenebrous Grey, not too much on the brush, and I'm just applying this where I want it to go a bit darker. So that's in the shadow areas, around the little rivets, in the gaps. Anywhere where you think it would be darker, just apply a little bit of this so that we get some good contrast between our really, really bright points and our really, really dark points. It's really good when you do it around rivets. It takes a little bit of time, but a little dot of this around each rivet makes them stand out and brings a bit of definition to your model. So the next section, I'm just going to show you how I painted the sort of front part of the main body armour, the sort of carapace. I'm using exact same colours, so burnt tin, rusty gold, old gold and silver gold mix. But here you'll see how I'm almost using the brush to give the look of a sort of textured layer to the model. But I just wanted to show that it's the same principles no matter what you're painting. But I'm using slightly thinned down paint in some points to blend the highlight into the centre or to the area where I want it to be brighter, like onto the edges or into the middle of these panels. Because sometimes these flat panels can be quite daunting, they can look a bit boring. But if you just use metallics like you would do a glaze, where you thin it down slightly and then draw the paints into the centre areas or wherever you want that highlight, you can get nice interesting outcomes. Especially metallics, you can use your brush doing straight lines left and right or up and down to get a nice textured look, brushed sort of steel, brushed gold look to the model. You'll notice also that the pipes and the chains, some of the finer bits on the top of this model haven't been dry brushed with metallic. That's because we're going to be doing weathering first and then doing metallic dry brushes over the top of them. So sometimes you do the dry brushing and then the weathering, but in other occasions you can do the weathering and then dry brush over the top to get a really heavily weathered look. And that's what I'm doing with those pipes and the chains and that. And that's why I've left them unpainted at this point. And here we can see me using a wash of the Tenebrous Grey, just pushing it down into those recessed areas so that you get a transition from the bright to the dark. So with glazing, when there's a lot of water and paint on the brush, where you leave the brush from the model is where the most paint will be left. So you drag it towards the area that you want to become darker or more saturated in that colour. So if here I want the edges to be darker, so I'm pushing the paint down towards those edges. So it was the gold trim that took the longest on this, probably a morning's work. But you can see working around, painted. We've now, probably in a morning, we've done all of the metallics, the trim, that gold trim, which as we know in Kitehouse models can take forever. And picked out some bits and bobs in gold across the model just to bring some definition. See, I've just roughly dry brushed the exhaust pipes there with just a little bit of the gunmetal, but I will be weathering them later on. And just picked out some bits on the gun, some gold, especially the trim. So these are the final images. As you can see, quite heavily weathered on the main framework. So that's the tutorial done for this first part, where we've done quite a bit of work on this already. You can actually put this model together now and it look pretty sweet on the tabletop already. Next stages will be, we've got to do some weathering on the main frame, we've got the freehand, we've got the glowing effects on the weapons. So to keep pushing this model forward, we can just keep building up our layers, especially the weathering, and to start making it look like he's been beaten and old. We've got all the glowing effects as well to do. So yeah, this first tutorial will help you across your entire knight range or your tanks or anything like that. You can use these principles on any other model. It's from the smallest Space Marine to the largest knight. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this one. Like, comment and subscribe, all of those amazing YouTube-y, social media-y type things. I'm also a commission painter based in the UK, so if you would like anything painted, just reach out and I can make those dreams happen so you can get this level of model onto the tabletop. I've got hundreds of other tutorials on my channel. So yeah, thanks for watching and happy painting, my fellow painters.